Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Tommy Todd, the Vice President of Security at Code 42. Tommy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Code 42 recently came out with a data exposure report. It has some interesting trends and just facts about where data is right now and how exposed it is to malicious actors. What did you find in that?
Yeah, it's interesting how we're starting to see an increase in insider risk as it relates to data exposure. There's been a lot of trends in the upward cycle since the pandemic. I think some of the studies we've seen, 2/3 of employees are more likely to take data now than they were prior to the pandemic. And a lot of this has to do with, the transition for employees moving from job to job, some of the uncertainty associated with their employment. But it's just one of those challenges that security teams are having to deal with today.
And one of the things you looked at in there was insider risk.
Mhm.
That's either an employee that isn't doing the right thing when it comes to cybersecurity, or an employee who may be malicious. What did you find in the study on that too?
Yeah, it's interesting to note that, employees have this sense of data entitlement. So when it comes to how they handle data and the types of data that they might take from one job to the next, there's just this notion that it's okay to do this. And the challenges with security is that this is really kind of a weak area from an enforcement perspective. The departing employee concern is oftentimes one of the weakest experiences from a security perspective, just because it's so common that we see data moving out. When you also take into consideration some of the dynamic changes that we're dealing with from work from home, there's a greater opportunity for employees to put data at risk accidentally or unintentionally. Due to the nature of the collaboration requirements, the need for increased productivity, there's a lot of room for mistakes. And as we're all prone to human error, it's one of those challenges that we have when it comes to data protection.
So we've seen a huge move into work from home now that coronavirus is part of life. This is something that opens up a lot of the threat vectors when it comes to cybersecurity. How can the government, how can industry help clamp down on that? And what's changing around that realm?
Yeah, it's been an interesting dynamic that we haven't really experienced in the history of cybersecurity in relation to the amount of challenges associated with working from home. Some of the trends that we're seeing, when we think about the employee work streams and how those have dramatically changed, employees have come to this conclusion that they want to work the way they want to work, how they want to work, and when they want to work. And that means they're working unusual hours, they're working longer hours. The way they treat their sanctioned devices in the home has dramatically changed as well. In a lot of cases, these devices become communal in nature because the whole family is sharing the same space as the employee. And there's a potential for personal activity by unauthorized users to occur on these devices. And again, when we talk about prone to mistakes, they're just one click away from potentially putting data at risk. So a lot of different challenges that we're associated with. From a resolution perspective, one of the challenges that we're seeing is how do we provide the right level of visibility? How do we understand our employees' workflows when it comes to the way they're sharing data back and forth? What are the requirements? We think about the increase in collaboration. Now that we're all remote, we don't really share an office with our peers. So in order to be able to share data, we're having to do it more dynamically and more remotely than ever before. And as a result of that, we need to make sure that we have the proper level of education on how to use these tools correctly so that we're not unintentionally oversharing. We also need to have security teams that have the right level of visibility on how data is being handled by these employees in this remote location. Again, one of the challenges that we see is that the perimeter has practically evaporated. And as a result of that, our traditional data protection strategies no longer apply. We have to think about it differently because we don't really have all the same technical controls that we had prior to the pandemic. So it's really caused a lot of organizations to rethink how they look at data protection.
So it seems pretty clear that if employees or if companies and it's government agencies want to retain these employees, that they're
Mhm.
going to have to move to a new world. I mean, people now have gotten a taste of the work from home and they like it a lot more. What can IT do to bolster that security? I mean, is it just completely changing the way that they're looking at this, or is it just a different way of attacking this problem?
Yeah, so the traditional way of typically addressing this concern would be to do more blocking and tackling, meaning that you're putting obstacles in front of the employee to prevent unintentional data exposure or even intentional data exposure. The challenge with that is that it doesn't align very well to the increase in productivity and collaboration that we're expected to see out of our employees. The more obstacles you put in the way of the employee, the more likely it is they're going to try to circumvent your security controls because they want to be able to do their jobs the way they want to do it. So when we talk about rethinking how we look at data visibility, we really need something that it kind of gets out of the way of the employee, but still has the ability to kind of do that trust but verify model being able to assume that your employees mean to do all the right things, but you need a way to verify that. So we need to rethink our strategies. We need to take a look at other solutions that provide deeper visibility. And we need to recognize that traditional strategies typically have blind spots. About 80% of the data that's being handled by an end user does not normally apply to policies like we used to. So when we think about how we used to look at governed data, so things that relate to compliance and classification and certain confidentiality and sensitivity levels, that created a massive blind spot for the other types of data that are being moved around in your organization that you might be missing. So holistically, we need to look at this in a different way. We need to reconsider our strategy.
Are we finding that employees are actually taking the cyber hygiene seriously? I mean, this kind of goes into the insider risk perspective as well. You know, are people going to stop being lazy at some point, or will they take this more seriously now that they have this privilege of staying at home more?
Right. This is a dramatic challenge, right? When we think about how people have become lazy, certain security hygiene has kind of lapsed as a result of being at home. We think of something as simple as locking your machine when you walk away. You know, we've seen a lapse in that. Most people don't lock their machine when they're at home because they don't expect an unauthorized user to have access to their device. But when it comes to the overall cultural approach to security, we need to take into consideration that it's not enough just to do point-in-time cyber safety training. You know, we're all used to maybe once or twice a year going through the iteration of being recertified, having to review our data protection policies and that kind of stuff. The challenge there is that it's too far and few between. We need to make this an ongoing conversation. And really, the employee needs to be part of the security discussion. We all need to take security seriously, and in order to create what we call a human firewall, because security starts with us. When we think of it in terms of insider risk and data exposure, we all shoulder the burden of potentially putting data at risk, whether we like it or not. So as long as we can continue to have this dialogue between security and the employees to make them part of the equation, your output of this, the downstream effect of this, is that they become more of a response to security rather than a consequence of security, if that makes sense.
Is this changing the way that malicious actors are attacking as well? You know, are they looking at a more decentralized model instead of you know, trying to go straight for the big kahuna, or you know, how are they doing this now?
Yeah, so when we think about how an attacker could perceive the remote world that we live in, they might think that it's easier now to get data out than it was before. And in a lot of cases, they're right. Because we are distributed, because we are remote, we feel like the security controls that we typically had have lapsed. We don't have the same kind of visibility. So there are challenges to our security approach. People are moving data out, whether it be appropriate or inappropriate. And it's definitely a concern that we have to address. And again, when we think about it from a traditional perspective, the way we used to do it is just not an applicable model anymore.
I want to move a little bit to zero trust. You know, zero trust, for those that don't know, is moving the amount of availability for certain security measures to different levels of need. The White House itself is looking at this. There's an executive order around it. So why don't you explain a little bit about what's going on within government about it, around zero trust right now?
Yeah, so there's a lot of focus put on classified to unclassified activity. So when we think about how data that might have started out in a classified environment is now arriving in an unclassified state, there's a lot of loss in visibility when those moments occur. The way data is being distributed, even in the government sector, has been a little challenging because data can be created and stored pretty much anywhere. And so trying to enforce the appropriate policies has been a bit of a struggle. So we go back to the visibility concern. If you have the mechanisms and the capability of being able to determine when data is moving from something that's classified to unclassified, you get a better sense of not only what kind of data is moving back and forth, but what the impact of that data might be to the policy enforcement. So when we think about it in the challenge state, you know, we go back to this trust but verify model. Zero trust, in essence, basically says we don't want to trust the user, the application, the data, the network. You know, all of these components we need to have some sort of scrutiny over. And in a lot of cases, that's correct. But you've hired people to do a job. You need to be able to start from a position of trust and then have a verification model to make sure that they're doing all the right things. So this is where some of that challenge comes in. How do you do this in a meaningful way that's non-disruptive, that doesn't seem too overbearing? And this is where we talk about a lot of that visibility to be able to see file lifecycle information from point A to point Z, and all the different networks that it might apply to. So definitely a challenge. Yeah.
And when it comes to the White House executive order, you know, what are they trying to get at with this new policy?
Yeah, they're really trying to figure out a way to, in relation to the data and the way the data moves, try to make sure that data is not inappropriately exposed. and we think about some of the more high profile attacks that have happened recently, a lot of this was more about surveillance attacks, just being aware of what's going on in the environment. But there are moments when data does get moved out. So being able to identify when those moments happen and be able to put a stop to it, or at least understand the impact of this data moving around inappropriately. So it really comes down to, when we think of insider risk, we think of it in terms of who do you trust, who do you not trust, how do you do the verification process to make sure people are doing all the right things. Zero trust, in my mind, is still kind of a moving target. We do talk to a lot of different federal organizations around what's the approach that they need to take, where do they need to start, what kind of things should we prioritize ahead of others. We like to point back to data is the biggest concern, right? Everything from a cybersecurity perspective, the only reason it exists is to protect data. And therefore, if you start there and you work your way back, the closer you are to the data, the more effective your programs are going to become. But again, organizations in different departments are still trying to figure out, where should we start? How should we implement? How do we assess what we already have? And is it working today? And if so, is it good enough to satisfy the zero trust requirement? Or is there some other things that we need to do? So I see a lot of, I wouldn't call it turmoil, but a lot of challenges with certain departments and how they've addressed things like data protection in the past. A lot of these things are going to have to be revised and revisited to be effective.
Tommy, the discussion has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Tommy Todd is the Vice President of Security at Code 42, and I'm your moderator, Scott Maucione. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Code 42.